Okay, let's start off by providing more context into the concept of business cycles. For the past few centuries, economists have analyzed this topic extensively. In large part, it has helped them understand how the economy moves in expansion and contraction periods. And quite importantly, economists have engaged in extensive studies focusing on the optimal ways of preventing the destructive effects of economic crises. There are different theories on how to keep an economy stable and growing. But we can surely say that part of the solution is the in-depth study of how business cycles operate. All right, let's begin with a bit of history. Back in the time of agricultural societies, production cycles were very unpredictable. Whether a harvest was going to be successful or not depended on weather conditions, which were pretty much impossible to control. Moreover, back then, plant and animal diseases had a considerable negative impact on the harvest. Today, things are different, as societies have become industrial in nature and economic activity tends to be much more diversified. However, today we have other reasons for the existing short and long-term economic movements. For example, population growth and the number of business enterprises opened or closed are two crucial factors shaping up an economy's growth potential. Now, let's see how a business cycle looks today. In exploring its phases, we will discuss changes in terms of total GDP growth, level of unemployment, consumer and business spending, and inflation. This graph is a stylized representation of how a typical economy fluctuates with time. Notice that on the vertical axis, we have the real output of goods and services, or real GDP, and that the horizontal axis represents the evolution of time. The red line shows average GDP, or the trend line of economic growth, over a selected period of time. The business cycle is characterized by fluctuations in economic activity, or the real gross domestic product of a country. It is important to note that business cycle phases vary in terms of amplitude and duration. On the graph, it might look like they are of similar size and happen at relatively regular intervals. However, in reality, different stages can last from a quarter up until a decade and even longer. For example, the downturn related to the dot-com bubble in the year 2000 lasted 3 years, while the financial crisis of 2008 lasted for approximately 5 to 6 years. Thus, predicting the phase in which an economy would be a few years from now could be a serious challenge. Now, let's go to the heart of the matter and explain the business cycle and its phases. A cycle usually starts with an expansion period. In this phase, GDP grows very fast, and there is an increase in employment, consumer spending, and business investments. Sales of goods and services increase rapidly, while the inflation rate picks up modestly. Eventually, economic growth slows down, and the expansion phase reaches its peak. This is the point where GDP is at its highest point. At the peak of the cycle, the total output is maximized and starts decreasing. The unemployment rate is still low and, in some cases, continues to decrease. Consumer and business spending is at its peak. The inflation rate goes up and accelerates further. After the peak, a recession or contraction period follows. Total economic activity declines, which means that negative growth rates are observed. Investments, consumption, and inflation decline too. Consumer spending and business investments in terms of industrial production decrease. Sales of goods and services slow down. As a result, the unemployment rate increases because businesses need to cut working hours, stop hiring, and start employee layoff rounds. When the recession is severe and lasts for 3 or more years, it turns into what is called depression. A notable example is the Great Depression in the 1930s, which caused the worldwide GDP to fall by 15%. A recession always reaches a trough, which is essentially the lowest point in the business cycle. At this point, the GDP growth rate starts changing from negative to positive. The trough is followed by a phase of recovery or early expansion, which is considered as the start of another business cycle. So we have an expansion, a peak, a contraction, a trough, an early recovery period, and a beginning of a new cycle. Here is a quick summary of what we've discussed so far. Please note that the overall economic activity, employment levels, consumer and business spending are highest during the peak period of a business cycle, while the levels of inflation usually reflect the cyclical changes with some time lag. Thus, inflation is low during the recovery stage, increases during the peak, and starts going down after the contraction has already started. So far, so good. Hopefully, you've learned a lot about the business cycle and its phases.